The biting wind cut through the busy streets of Chicago as 17-year-old Jake hurried down the sidewalk, his hands stuffed into his pockets. It was the dead of winter, and the city was wrapped in a thick blanket of snow. He had just left basketball practice, his backpack slung over his shoulder and his breath curling in the frosty as he turned the corner near a dimly lit alley. Something caught his eye. A hunched figure sitting on a tattered piece of cardboard, shivering violently. A homeless man, wrapped in rags, rubbed his hands together for warmth, his face obscured by an overgrown beard and tangled hair. Jake hesitated. He had seen homeless people before, but something about this man made him pause. Maybe it was the way his fingers trembled, or the way his eyes, deep, tired, and sunken, held a strange kind of sorrow. "Hey, you okay?" Jake asked, stepping closer. The man flinched as if startled by the attention. "I'm fine, kid," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Just cold." Jake glanced at the heavy varsity jacket he was wearing. It was his favorite, blue and gold, with his name embroidered on the sleeve. But right now, he knew someone needed it more than he did. Without thinking, he unzipped it and draped it over the man's shoulders. "Here, you need this more than me." The man stiffened. His fingers gripped the fabric, his gaze flickering with something unreadable. Then, just as quickly, his expression shifted to shock. His eyes locked onto the embroidery on the sleeve. "J. Carter," a sharp breath escaped his lips. His voice quivered. "Carter?" Jake frowned. "Yeah, that's my last name." The man's expression crumbled, and his hands clenched the jacket like it was a lifeline. "Carter," he whispered again, his voice breaking. I knew a Carter once." Jake's heart pounded as an eerie sensation swept over him. "Who?" The man looked up, eyes glistening. "Your father." Jake's breath caught in his throat. His fingers twitched as he processed what the man had just said. "My father," he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. The homeless man's lips trembled, and he clutched the jacket tighter as if holding onto a lost piece of himself. His eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, bore a startling familiarity. Something about them reminded Jake of old family pictures. You knew my dad?" Jake's words came out slow, careful. The man swallowed hard, his atoms apple bobbing. "Not just knew him," he murmured. I am his father." The world seemed to tilt under Jake's feet. His mind scrambled for an explanation. His grandfather? No, that was impossible. His grandfather had died years ago. Hadn't he? That can't be true, Jake stammered. "My grandpa's gone. My dad said he passed away before I was even born." The man let out a hollow chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "That's what he told you." He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "I guess I can't blame him for that." The truth was too painful. Jake took a shaky step back. The snow crunched beneath his sneakers. His mind raced with questions, doubts, fears. "Who are you?" he finally demanded. The man lifted his chin, his weary eyes locking onto Jake's. "My name is Robert Carter, and I swear to you, Jake, I'm your grandfather." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the man. Robert Carter, his supposed grandfather. "No, that's not possible," Jake muttered, shaking his head. "My dad wouldn't lie about something like that." Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. "He didn't lie, son. He just hid the truth." Jake crossed his arms, a mix of doubt and fear swirling inside him. "Why would he do that?" Robert exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. "Because he wanted to forget me. And maybe he had every right to." His voice was tinged with regret. Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Robert's gaze dropped to the ground, as if he was searching for the right words. "Years ago, I made mistakes that cost me everything. I was young, reckless, and selfish. I abandoned my family when your father was just a boy." He lifted his head, his eyes glistening. "I left, thinking I could start fresh. But life had a way of humbling me. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. Your father had grown up without me. And when I tried to come back, he didn't want anything to do with me." Jake swallowed hard, his emotions tangled in knots. "So, he cut you out of his life?" Robert nodded. "And I don't blame him. I failed him when he needed me the most. And now, after all these years, I have nothing left." Jake looked at the man's frail frame, his tattered clothes, the way his hands trembled in the cold. He had been nothing more than a stranger just minutes ago. But now he was family. And Jake didn't know how to feel about that. Jake's breath hitched as he processed Robert's confession. Could he really be my grandfather? His father had never spoken about his dad. Not once. Jake had always assumed he'd passed away long ago. But now, standing in front of this frail man, his mind spun with questions. If my dad didn't want anything to do with you, why are you here? Jake finally asked, his voice hesitant. Robert sighed, his shoulders slumping. I guess I just wanted to see him one last time. His voice was barely above a whisper. I wasn't looking for forgiveness, just closure. Jake bit his lip, his heart pounding. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to pretend this moment never happened. But something inside him, the same instinct that had made him offer his jacket, told him that this man, no matter his past, didn't deserve to be left out in the cold. You have nowhere to go, do you? Jake finally asked. Robert chuckled dryly. I think that much is obvious. A war raged inside Jake. Logic told him to leave. Compassion told him to stay. He knew his father wouldn't approve. But could he really turn his back on a man who had just admitted his deepest regret? He exhaled sharply. Come with me. Robert's eyes widened in surprise. What? You can't sleep out here, Jake said firmly. I have a friend who works at a shelter nearby. I'll make sure you have a warm place to sleep tonight. Robert hesitated. Why would you do that? Jake swallowed, staring at the man, the stranger who was his grandfather. Because sometimes people deserve a second chance. Jake led Robert through the dimly lit streets, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. What if my dad finds out? What if I'm making a mistake? But as he glanced at Robert, shivering despite the jacket, he knew he couldn't turn back now. The homeless shelter wasn't far, a modest brick building with a small sign reading Haven House. Jake had come here before with his church group to volunteer, but tonight, it felt different. A woman at the front desk looked up as they entered. Hey, Jake. She greeted him with a warm smile. Hey, Lisa, Jake said, forcing a smile. Do you have a bed available? Lisa glanced at Robert, her expression softening. For him. Jake nodded. Yeah, he needs a place for the night. Lisa checked her screen and nodded. You're in luck. We have an open cot. She turned to Robert. You're welcome to stay. We serve breakfast at 7 a.m. Robert exhaled, a mix of relief and gratitude flashing in his eyes. Thank you, he murmured. As Lisa led him toward the sleeping area, Robert turned back to Jake. You didn't have to do this. Jake met his gaze, trying to suppress the lump in his throat. Yeah, I did. Robert nodded, a ghost of a smile forming. Your kindness, it reminds me of someone I used to know. Jake didn't ask who. Instead, he gave a small nod and stepped back. This is where I should leave, right? But as he turned toward the door, something inside him whispered, this isn't over yet. The next morning, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to check on Robert. Why do I care so much? He barely knew the man, yet something about him felt familiar. After school, he rode his bike straight to Haven House. As he walked in, Lisa gave him a knowing look. He's still here, she said before he could ask. Had breakfast, but didn't say much. Jake found Robert sitting alone at a table, staring at a cup of coffee. Hey, Jake greeted, taking the seat across from him. Robert looked up, surprised but not unwelcome. Didn't think I'd see you again. Jake shrugged. Figured I'd check in. Robert chuckled, shaking his head. You're a good kid. A brief silence settled between them before Jake finally asked, You said I reminded you of someone. Who? Robert's fingers tightened around the coffee cup, his jaw working like he was debating something. Finally, he sighed. My son, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I lost him years ago. Jake's breath hitched. What happened? Robert hesitated, then looked Jake straight in the eye. His mother and I split up when he was a baby. She took him, moved away. I searched, but I never found them. His voice cracked. I always wondered if he ever knew I existed. A strange chill ran down Jake's spine. His mom had never talked about his grandfather. She always avoided the subject. What was your son's name? Jake asked, his heart pounding. Robert hesitated before answering. Matthew Reynolds. Jake's stomach dropped. His father's name was Matthew Reynolds. His hands shook as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a family photo, his dad, his mom, and himself as a little kid that he slid it across the table. "That's my dad," he whispered. Robert stared at the photo, his eyes widening, his face draining of color. His lips parted, but no words came out. Jake swallowed hard. "You're my grandfather." The room seemed to freeze. Robert clutched the photo like it was the most precious thing in the world. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Jake," his voice broke. "You're his son?" Jake nodded, barely able to breathe. Tears slipped down Robert's weathered face. I never thought I'd see my family again." Jake's mind raced. He had so many questions, so much to process. But one thing was certain, this was fate, and his life would never be the same again. Jake sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The homeless man he had helped, the stranger he had felt an inexplicable connection to, was his grandfather. Robert clutched the photo like it was his last lifeline, his hands trembling. "Your father. Matthew, is he?" Jake swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "He passed away 5 years ago. Galaxido." Robert shut his eyes, pain washing over his face like a tidal wave. His breath came in shallow gasps, as if the weight of the revelation was crushing him. "I lost him again." Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Jake didn't know what to say. He barely knew this man, yet in his heart, something told him that this was right. This moment was meant to happen. Lisa, who had been watching from a distance, approached cautiously. "Is everything okay?" Jake turned to her, his voice unsteady. "Lisa, this is my grandfather." Lisa's eyes widened in shock. She glanced between them, seeing the undeniable resemblance. "Oh my God." Robert wiped his eyes and let out a shaky breath. "I don't know what to say." Jake did. "Come home with me." He blurted out. Robert's eyes snapped up, filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Jake, I need to talk to my mom first." Jake continued, his heart racing. "But I want to know you, and I think she should too." Tears welled in Robert's eyes. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Jake said firmly. "You're family." Robert covered his mouth with his hand, his emotions getting the best of him. He nodded slowly, as if he still couldn't believe this was real. Lisa smiled through her own teary eyes. "Looks like fate had a plan after all." Jake glanced at his grandfather, his real, living grandfather, and knew in that moment that his life had changed forever. And this was just the beginning. That evening, Jake sat across from his mother, Claire, at the kitchen table. His hands were clasped together, his fingers interlocked tightly as he tried to find the right words. Claire, a woman in her early 40s with soft brown eyes and streaks of gray in her hair, noticed his hesitation. "Jake, what's wrong? You've been quiet since you got home." Jake exhaled, his heart pounding. "Mom, I met someone today, and I need to tell you something." Claire leaned forward, concern etching her face. "Okay." Jake's mouth felt dry, but he forced himself to continue. "You remember the homeless man I helped? The one I gave my jacket to?" Claire nodded slowly. "Yes, I do." "What?" Jake inhaled deeply. "Mom, he's Grandpa Robert." Silence. Claire blinked, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. "What?" Jake swallowed hard. He had a picture of Dad, the same one we have. "He told me he's Robert Evans, your father." Claire's entire body stiffened. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Jake saw her eyes darken with something he hadn't seen in years. "Pain?" "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." Jake reached across the table, gently placing his hand on hers. "Mom, I know it's hard to believe, but it's true." He recognized Dad in the picture. He said his name. He told me how he lost contact with you and Dad years ago. He never stopped looking for us. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she pulled her hand away. She stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen, her emotions unraveling. "No, oh no, no. He left. He abandoned us, Jake. He walked out on us when I was just a kid. He never came back." Jake's heart ached at her words. "Mom, he said he didn't mean to leave forever. He was struggling. He lost everything and didn't know how to come back." Claire let out a sharp, bitter laugh, her voice breaking. "And now, after all these years, he suddenly appears as a homeless man on the street?" And I'm supposed to what? Forgive him. Jake stood up, his voice soft but firm. I don't know, Mom, but I do know that he's hurting. He's alone, and he's still your father. Claire turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. Jake, you don't understand what it was like. The nights I cried myself to sleep because he wasn't there. The way Mom worked herself to exhaustion just to make sure we survived. He wasn't there for me when I needed him most. And now, you expect me to just let him back into my life. Jake hesitated. I don't expect anything, Mom. But don't you at least want to hear his side of the story? Claire covered her face with her hands, inhaling sharply. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she whispered, "Where is he now?" Jake felt a flicker of hope. Lisa took him to the shelter for the night. But I told him I'd talk to you and that maybe, just maybe, you'd want to see him. Claire stood there, her emotions waging war inside her. Would she agree to see him? Or would the pain of the past be too much to bear? The next morning, Jake anxiously paced outside the homeless shelter. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp morning air as he checked his phone. His mom had agreed, hesitantly, to meet Robert, but now, as the minutes dragged on, doubt gnawed at him. Would she actually show up? Just as he was about to lose hope, a familiar silver sedan pulled up to the curb. Claire stepped out, her hands stuffed in her coat pockets, her face carefully unreadable. Jake exhaled, relieved. Mom, you came. Claire's gaze flickered toward the shelter door. I don't know why I'm here, Jake. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Because you need answers. With a heavy sigh, Claire nodded, and together they walked inside. Robert sat on a worn-out couch in the common area, his frail hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. When he saw Claire, he nearly dropped the cup, his breath hitched. His eyes, tired, sunken, but unmistakably familiar, filled with shock, regret, and hope. Claire? His voice trembled that Claire's hands clenched at her sides. Seeing him up close, the man who had once been her hero, then her ghost, sent a rush of emotions crashing into her. She swallowed hard. It's really you, Robert stood shakily. It's me, sweetheart. His lips wobbled into a hopeful smile, but Claire took a step back. Jake watched the raw tension between them. He could feel the years of pain in the space between mother and grandfather, but Claire's voice was tight. Where were you? Robert sighed, his shoulders slumping. I wish I had a good answer for you, but all I have is the truth. I lost everything, money, house, dignity. And when I had nothing left, I was ashamed. Too ashamed to come back, to face you and your mother. So I ran. Claire's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Do you know what that did to us? To Mom? She worked herself into an early grave, trying to keep us afloat. She died thinking you abandoned us. Robert's face crumpled, and a sob broke from his lips. I never stopped looking for you. I swear it. But by the time I had the courage to come back, you were gone. I couldn't find you. Claire turned away, pressing her fingers against her lips as she tried to compose herself. Jake could see her walls cracking, but the pain was still raw. Why now? She whispered. Why after all these years? Robert took a shaky breath. Because fate put your son in my path. And for the first time in decades, I saw a second chance. His voice wavered. Claire, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But if there's even the smallest part of you that wants to know me again, I'm here. The room fell into silence. Jake held his breath, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment that could either break or rebuild a family. Claire turned back to Robert, her eyes searching his. She saw the years of regret etched into his face. The exhaustion of a man who had spent a lifetime running from his own mistakes. She inhaled deeply. I don't know if I can forgive you. Robert's face fell, but she continued, her voice softer. I think I'd regret it if I didn't at least try. A slow, hopeful smile spread across Robert's face. That's all I could ever ask for. Jake exhaled, relief flooding him. This wasn't a perfect ending. There were still wounds to heal, years to recover. But for the first time in decades, they weren't strangers anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start again. 1 year later, the summer sun cast a warm golden glow over the park, where families laughed, children played, and the scent of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air. On a shaded bench near the lake, Jake, Claire, and Robert sat together. 3 generations, once separated by time and pain, now rebuilding what was almost lost forever. Claire still carried her guarded nature, but her walls had softened. The anger, once so raw, had faded into something else. Understanding, acceptance, and the cautious steps toward forgiveness. Robert, now healthier and living in a small apartment thanks to Claire's help, looked years younger. His once hollow cheeks had filled out, and the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by something much more powerful: hope. Jake smiled as he watched them banter. They still had their moments. Claire was still stubborn, Robert still had regrets, but they were trying. "Remember the old fishing trips you used to take me on, Grandpa?" Jake asked, his eyes twinkling. Robert chuckled. "Of course, kiddo. You used to get so excited every time you caught something, even if it was just a twig." Claire smirked. "And you used to come home covered in mud. Mom would have a fit." Robert's expression softened. "Your mother had a good heart, Claire. She raised you well." Claire swallowed hard but nodded. The wounds of the past hadn't disappeared, but they were no longer bleeding. Jake stood up, stretching his arms. "How about we make some new memories? Grandpa, you up for teaching me how to fish again?" Robert's eyes lit up. "I thought you'd never ask." Claire hesitated, then smiled. "I guess I'll come too." Jake grinned. This was it. The past would always be part of them, but it no longer defined them. As they walked toward the lake together, side by side, Jake knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, life gives second chances. And when it does, you take them with both hands.